I'm the only representative from the Akasha team. Here's our link to the log, which is I came to the conclusion 2 calls ago. It's just a idea pool, and we can either jump on something that is outlined there, or we can also jump in something that's has been discussed on the chat. This is an open invitation to discuss different aspects of Andy already mentioned identity, the way that we can define what Web3 social means and how it should evolve, and which mistakes we shouldn't make that may have been made before due to business models, interest, that are beyond the interest of the individual that actually wants to use and exchange and socialize with people on the web. Yeah.
So I do have some place to suggest as a beginning, relatively so. And that is the series of links which has been posted in the Akasha channel recently, because there's some genuinely fascinating stuff there. And as many of us on this call know, there's just an amazing amount of convergence happening in so many different ways at the moment. And I would suggest we can get to perhaps the concept of interfaces, which has a lot to do with active inference and the work that Daniel Friedman and some other people in Kernel are doing. We can talk a little bit about reputation and some of the ideas from the ecological intelligence people in Kernel that have been current, particularly from Christina and Rich. But where I would really like to begin, Martin, is if you will tell us a little bit more about ADX and some of the research you've been doing around moderation, and then we can use that as a means into sort of
exactly, and this will be great because I have spent some time on this and really have to do homework on all the other links in this channel. So I will gladly give you my insights that I have from the current state, and then we can move on. And I'm very happy if also others share the insights they got, even if they might not, but I am sure that somehow they might even be compatible with this. Okay, great. So what I really did out of selfish interest for understanding what other projects that outside of Akasha are working on in the decentralized social space, I followed the Blue Sky initiative for a while. They have a channel on Discord called Desocial Commons, and in that space, the ADX experiment has been basically recently evolved, and so what they are actually trying to explore here is an architecture proposal for authenticated data, as they call it, the authenticated data experiment. And did someone share the link already? I'll put it here on their GitHub. Oh yeah, it's there. Exactly. And so, what I am interested in is really to understand the ability, like solving this chicken and egg problem a bit. If like you are building your own social community or network, and how do you make sure that in a future this is interoperable with other social communities, and if so, then there's another challenge on top of that, and that's the one I was really diving deeply into, and this is the challenge of moderation there. How can we come up with an approach to moderate content that somehow is decentralized? At the same time, I think that's even the impossibility there, because when you're having a group of people discussing a topic, and then someone else comes in out of context, or there's also spam and so on, this might be seen out, depending on the context, as spam or not, or as in context or out of context. So that's why I very much enjoyed the way that they are proposing to set up basically two different layers, whereas one is this, they call it the speech layer, which is an open distributed pool of individuals that each of them are controlling their own speech, so to say. And then you have a curation moderation approach on top of that. And then you have interfaces that are the what they call the reach layer. So there are some aggregators basically on top. And the curation and moderation approach could be seen, and that's very much in alignment with how I saw this, but I never managed to write it up as well and structured as they have it. So curation moderation is basically a number of different services that are able to provide their lens on the speech layer, and that's then really a choice of the individual to which of those services you want to subscribe to, and that's the lens that you are looking at data through. There's one aspect of it is that I think is less defined, and also my computational knowledge honestly is not maybe as deep, but there's one part where it's proposed that there are obviously there are incidents where content needs to be removed. So somehow there is an operator, so it's not 100% with the individual. There's still the possibility to remove data or delete content. And they propose kind of a Merkle tree approach that there can be also computations and indexation like on top of these, like there is a kind of a purge request or something, and then certain data would be forced to be removed, and then everything in this entire tree would be recalculated, but there would be traces left of the fact that something that was previously there had been removed. I'm not 100% understanding at which layer this would happen. Maybe that would be at the layer of some kind of service provider already, right? That you can see, okay, there's content that apparently was there but has been taken away, and that at least leaves some transparency on the remaining transparency, I would say. That's my my lens on the ADX work. I've seen also that they are working on a data structure. They're trying to solve different ways of how you can implement such a universal, content sharing protocol. I'm not entirely understanding this, but what I see is gladly a lot of overlap in the approach that is taken there to the architecture choices that are being made with the Akasha stack that is using Textile, which is based on IPLD, and the way it's set up, or the way the Textile work is basically probably quite compatible with the approach that they are proposing here. The concern always is, okay, there are different already Web3 social initiatives. I mean, are we all expecting that we will win and therefore be the standard? So, and that's very hard. So hopefully we are able, and I guess, and that's what Blue Sky tries to do, to propose something that is very universal and compatible, but also a little bit from the perspective of this is gonna be the standard, which then I say, hey, but there is already things being worked on, so how do we align them? This is an open question I have.
Thank you very much for that overview and intro. I will also say that Martin very kindly shared a video. Akasha has a series of ongoing conversations with a whole bunch of interesting people working somehow in identity moderation, community building. And it's Akasha conversation number 6. Martin, if you want to share it in the chat, that'd be wonderful, with a man called Aaron Rabinowitz. And Aaron set up a community called Monsters Island, which is a really interesting test case for all kinds of reasons, predominantly being that they set out to have no rules and to invite a very wide array of people from across the political spectrum in particular. And it was, as Aaron thought it would be, an absolute dumpster fire. And it eventually he left and the community ended when one of the people involved was also part of a national shooting in America. And there are two things which came out of this conversation which were really fascinating to me, because I find myself more on the kind of like David Griever anarchist, fragments of an anarchist anthropology approach to things, and therefore I'm not necessarily like, I haven't been a huge fan of moderation before, never having thought too deeply about it. And this conversation with Aaron really kind of brought some interesting things to the forefront, not only his perspective that without some kind of moderation, any community of human beings is statistically extremely likely to end up in the kind of situation where at least one person is involved in like some heinous crime, which is pretty dark, but like that was literally what he said in that conversation. And the other aspect of it that I found really fascinating was this like much deeper question that, okay, like, is sunlight the best disinfectant? Can we like have transparency and accountability in our systems and have more open and clear moderation standards, which is hard enough to answer from a technical perspective, but it does seem somewhat tractable, that question. But the deeper question is, if people are moderated and their content removed, where do they go? And do those places not radicalize them further? And Aaron was like, it's a wonderful question. I don't have a good answer to it. In fact, we don't even really know of research methodologies that could begin to think about that kind of question. And this, it's such a fascinating little nugget, because it really gets us into the heart of sociality, right? Like, how do we have really hospitable communal spaces, particularly in the digital world, in which I feel like safe and I'm not exposed to too much, sort of uncomfortable content, but still moved to at least the edges of my own echo chamber or filter bubble.
So there's this quote. There's this quote that Philip came up with. There's the freedom of attention, basically also, right? So it's not only freedom of speech, but also you to your question, Andy, like you want to feel safe when you enter a specific space, and you also want to see information on the point in a way, and not completely out of context. That's okay. I say that from my perspective at the moment of looking at the Akasha.Ethereum world experiment, and maybe to mention that the echo chamber challenge that we had there was that I thought this is a very early stage. It's very top-down moderated or moderated at the moment, just a few people, but we saw the necessity of having this, and someone started posting young ladies in underwear. And that's like really a challenge. It's borderline, but one post is okay. But when it's like 10 after the other, and they are apparently not, I mean, they are apparently there to test the space, and then, you become like, I became quite uncomfortable about this, and I decided and I wrote about it. I said, this is not in context here. And although it's probably not violating any of our current rules, we took it away. And I was, but it's it's a borderline case, and that's where I say I'm speaking from the perspective of someone that wants to curate probably a space with a specific interest. So I'm biased. I concluded that probably what we need to improve is the ability of the individual to make choices about curate their own information, their own feed, basically, and not be exposed to everything. So you need to be able to set filters on your own. Yet again, then I leave it here and back to you, because maybe you have the answer. How do you then, by doing this, avoid the echo chamber, right? Yeah.
So I don't have the answer, and I never do. So I'm gonna consistently disappoint you as if that's ever the question that you ask, which is wonderful. And what I do want to kind of point to is just a few thoughts around this that I have, because as you know, so I built a curation system that is entirely economic, right? And it is not at all my claim that this applies to sociality broadly speaking, but there are genuinely interesting economic models that we can use for the transparent ranking, i.e. curation of content, which are Sybil resistant and provably fair, right? And what I mean by fair is that like the people who rank highest provide the most value to the community, and it is possible to have an oversized effect on those who rank highly if they use a lot of money to do that. But like the question here is a much more fuzzy and like human one, right? It's about relationships and about these like dynamic networks of relationships. And what I kind of want to point at first is this really beautiful thought that Christina dropped in Slack the other day as it relates to ecological intelligence, which is something that her and Rich have been discussing at length. Rich is an ecologist who's been running all sorts of wonderful experiments across America and elsewhere, trying to link the link ecological health with economic wealth, and has a whole bunch of IoT devices in forests linked to different kinds of data processing things, and trying to figure out that one, which is really, really cool. And Christina writes that if ecology is the history of relationships and culture is that of coherence, then might reputation be the heart of a life, a signature spanning the whole, orchestral by associations and inward reflections. Mapping this would be like a fingerprint of influence. Without judgments, reputation might emerge as a pattern of heat. And where this pattern meets the plane of existence, and what coherences are read there, right? Like revealing where this pattern meets the plane of existence and what coherences are read there. Mapping these hubs, which are like an overlay of coherences, reputation becomes shared and cultural, neither good nor bad, simply hotter or cooler. Reputation becomes like music or water. And this is a very interesting idea to me, framed in different language than perhaps like the technical stack that we're looking at with ADX and this kind of stuff. But it's really, really fascinating, right? That you can think about our fingerprints of influence as heat maps, and use those heat maps, which are evolving and dynamic processes in time, to like filter information that you see in like whatever system that you're using, and have as like the ground some transparent economic algorithm that anybody can examine, verify, and influence should they wish to, right? Because that's like my concern in like the system that I built, as I've told you before, and some of the people on this call will know this, that I was like operating in a very, very narrow domain because I was working for a company that had launched a token through an ICO, which, is a separate question about like the ethics and morality of doing that. But I was like, okay, I have a token that has 6.8 billion units that exists and will ever exist. It's this virtual money in the form that Michael is probably very familiar with. And we can hopefully talk a little bit about open money as it relates to these kinds of things in a moment. But there is the set amounts, and I can use that as a parameter to simplify the way in which the system runs. It's much more difficult to consider like how can we build a general curation system in which, because like the question that begs is, how does the token get brought into existence? And what kinds of actions justify the like minting of money? That's a really, really like fascinating question. At the moment, it's like bureaucratic fiat, right? Or some people on the internet telling a fun story and launching an ERC20 token, or it's like across various different networks. So it's like, are there ways that we can use reputational heat maps and the network of influences, anchor those in chain and use them to both like filter content that is appropriate to me and which I will find to be contextually relevant, as well as grounded in like a shared economic substrate that has value for all people who are using it. So no answer, just a much more rambling question, which is basically all I promise you.
So yeah, I just a thought that crossed my mind, of course, and I don't want to be too plain, yeah, and coming down too hard from the poetic level. But when you talk about a token and some incentive structure in place for this heat map approach, in a way, it is a curation effort that reminds me of like what you would do when you're an editor, of course, of a book or a journal, where people are actually also willing to pay money for this, and we forgot that this used to be, because now everyone reads maybe everything free on the internet. But if it was like be the different journals that you have, and there's an effort attached to curating this information, there was a price. It has never been as clean, because especially in the journalism, there's always advertisement money has been always there already, but still. So it is, again, coming back to the concept of because this universal moderation approach, I think, is something it's super hard to achieve ever. You will, but what you need to make everyone understand is that they are always are going to look through a specific lens at the information they receive. So as long as you can indicate the gaps and explain why this gap is there, like why are you not seeing this, and then you also have a choice to see, and then you can of course ask also, is it gone for good, or is it not there because it's the way I've defined that I don't want to see the content? That's two other things. When you realize 90% of the content is removed and like censored out, then you will start realizing also yourself, hey, that's actually probably not a good resource I'm looking at. Yeah, when it's censored, or when it's not censored, but when it's curated out based on my preferences, and this is something I've consciously chosen to do, so that might be a good thing. And it's like if I go to the supermarket and I buy the Times magazine or the Economist, or I buy the one on Mac optimization or something, it's like I do have a choice. I did this choice, and I will not be upset to see that in the Mac journal there's no information on the stock market.
So I completely agree with you. What I'm, and I'll illustrate this through like two stories, right? Because these are all pretty like nebulous things, like reputation interfaces and moderation, and it's always going to be an interesting task to dance between the three, but they are intimately linked. And so like the first story is this, right, in terms of like what kind of actions on a verifiable and shared ledger can we use to mint more money. And this goes to the heart of like, currently everybody talks about the fact that money has to have three features: store of value, minimum exchange, unit of accounts. Andreas Antonopoulos, for instance, makes the point that like, look, we've already got a fourth feature of money, which is a universal ledger of transactions. We've never had that before, and it's kind of interesting because you can do a whole bunch of stuff with it. In addition to that, it's programmable. So that's cool, because it means that it's not limited by like politics or fiat, but by your own creativity. But like, that's not where it ends, right? Universal ledger of transactions. There's other things that we can think about because it's programmable. And my particular question in life is like, okay, so I understand from like traditions that I am interested in, and from the place where I come, that wealth means having enough to share, and that a flourishing society is premised in reciprocity, right? So how can I program reciprocity into money? And this is like very simply illustrated in the case of, like, for instance, Gitcoin grants. If Gitcoin had not launched a token that had no economic utility and was supposedly about governance rights and supposedly had no economic value for legal reasons in their launch post, the way in which they could have thought about this kind of thing is radically different, because if I fund a grant through Gitcoin, that is an on-chain action, right, which can be used to like mint GTC as like a return, right? There, you've already programmed reciprocity into money. I fund a grant, I get some percentage of that fund. Say I give like 100 DAI to Akasha, I can get 100 GTC in return. GTC does not need to have economic value in this example, right? Just 100 GTC in return. And then GTC can be used to rank and curate grants so that we don't have to have a fraud and detection division that is trying to use a bunch of humans to solve a O of N problem, right? And that's like, cool, we can program reciprocity into money. And like, there's a good example of doing it, because like that action of funding another grant using the chain, using the shared and verifiable ledger, is a good enough reason to bring more money into existence, right? Like it's justifiable in that sense. And it has this neat feature of reciprocity. So that's like a very practical example of kind of what I'm talking about. The other is the signature NFT contracts that were like, you can find them on sign.kernel.community. We'll launch like publicly tomorrow. There was like a very fascinating series. Woo, exactly. Yeah, there's been a long journey on that front, but there was a really, really interesting kind of unfolding with those particular contracts, because initially how I had written them was as simple as possible, and the mint function for like the NFTs, which you can select text and then it like generates a beautiful image for you using a phyllotaxis pattern, mint that as an NFT. That mint function was completely public, completely open. I was like, hell yeah, this is, I mean, I'm an anarchist, and like anybody can do what they want with it. And a friend of mine looked at the contracts and audited them, and he was like, this is a terrible idea. And I was like, no, it's not. A wonderful idea. Anybody can mint what they want. I understand that, and it's fine. And if people mint like terrible and horrific images, we'll just like exclude them from our interface, because there is a difference between contractual reality and social reality. And he was like, okay, cool, like nice story. But what people do is they are people out there who look for these open collections, and they use them to like mint child pornography or other like illegal stuff. And then secondary marketplaces like OpenSea are forced to take them down. So you will not be able to like appear on any of these other platforms. And so we were like, okay, fine. I guess we'll like think about a better way to do the mint function, right? And initially, what that looked like was, like the first proposal was, just have like a creator account and only the creator can mint. But that's like a terrible idea, because A, it's permissioned, and B, if the creator key is compromised, it's catastrophic for the whole collection from a security perspective. Okay, so that's no good. The second solution, which is what we actually like implemented at first and wrote into the contract, was like, okay, you can have a separate signer account, which is different from the creator of the contract. And when you call the mint function, you have to have an additional data param, and that data has to be an Ethereum signed message from this particular account. And we even like went and like made sure, okay, you can set the signer account to 0x0 in the case that you want, and then it's basically like having an open mint function. And we thought, okay, that's good enough. And that's kind of like moderation, right, in a sense. But then we actually wrote the application, and it turned out that like having a like front-end application that then needed to talk to somewhere else where there would be the private key of the signer account and authenticate against that server, and then have it sign the data and return it to the front end, and the front end then sends it to the contract. It was like an absolute mess. It's unnecessarily complex. It was just really ugly, and like it added all sorts of complexity that we didn't want in the application. And so we were like, okay, there has to be a better way than this. So been a long time thinking about this, and eventually what we did is we have this like really neat way of returning data, like returning the metadata for NFTs from the contract. We base 64 encoded the JSON in the contract itself and send it back. And when you mint an NFT, what you actually do is you just store in the contract the like two indices, right? You store a number for the character that the highlight starts at and the character that the highlight ends at. And then when people call like the contract to be like, what is the metadata for token ID number 2? it uses like those 2 character indices to return base 64 encoded JSON that like has the correct image in it. And like it was a lot of work to do that, but it's really, really interesting because there's this like creative way of doing things that actually at the product, well, at like the level of the protocol, like just the contract, moderation is not really required, because what we've done is like we've confined the expressive space to just the essay, right? Anybody can call mint, but you can only store indices which apply to like this particular piece of writing. And so like that confinement means that like moderation, broadly speaking, is not necessary, because like, sure, come on, like anybody mints to pass in 2 numbers, you can do whatever, but like you're only ever going to get an NFT that like in some way is associated with the essay, even if it's like some rather meaningless string from the essay. And so like that's an example of like kind of creatively thinking about these shared economic substrates as a means around like moderation in like constrained cases. And the final thing I'll say, I'm sorry, I know this has been a lot, but like the last thing is that the thing which most inspires me, apart from like the Bitcoin white paper and the launch of Ethereum, has been the Arweave white paper. And the reason that that is the case is because in that paper, they talk about a really fascinating idea called adaptive interacting incentive agents. And there, what they do is they take like the BitTorrent protocol, which is basically what Arweave is built on, and they like adapt it such that you have these like, yeah, adaptive interacting incentive agents. And they make the claim in that paper that with adaptive interacting incentive agents, these like people who are incentivized to make games that others can play and to go on doing that kind of stuff. The first example is like getting people who are running Arweave nodes to run an IPFS bridge. And if you see like another peer who is running an Arweave node, but also an IPFS bridge, which you can signal, then you can like reward them slightly more, right? And that's like the first game that takes place. And then you can like have these like ongoing adaptive incentive games that increasingly incentivize pro-social behavior. And that is completely fascinating to me, because like that's the kind of thinking that can help us like dynamically create more contextual spaces, right? It's like that's really what the Arweave team is doing at like the base layer. And Wildfire, which was the first version of this, has like moved on to like numerous other versions as the network, as people have like written, like there's no consensus in Arweave. It's totally mind-bending for people who have been involved for as long as I have in like crypto. You're like, what do you mean? Consensus is the whole thing. Like, no, yeah. Put that down. And you have these like everybody like running their own version of the game, right? And you can write whatever like game rules you want into your client, and it still needs to be able to talk to the network. But beyond that, it doesn't need to like keep consensus. That's why they call it a smart weave instead of a blockchain. So it's like a really, really fascinating idea. And I think that it can be applied analogically at like higher levels, using this notion of like reciprocity, creativity, and then like adaptiveness or adaptability, if I'm being correct. So, yeah.
I think one thing that I'd be curious to get folks' thoughts on is like, I think sometimes this feels very situated in like our existing attention economy, and then how we think about algorithmically addressing what that looks like. And if I take a step back and I think about like how much of that was dictated by starting to build the internet as free, and only advertising business models are the way to monetize that, and then only scale is the way to, you know, get the network effects to get like it feels like so much of this is on this path. And that like if we went back and said like, hey, what is the, how do we think about curation in this public sphere? Does this need to be algorithmic, or can this be curated by groups of humans in different ways? And like, how might we organize that differently? I don't know if that strikes him, but I sometimes like feel like I lose the thread when it comes to Blue Sky, because, and same thing with lit proto, or not lit, lens, right? Where like they feel to me very skeuomorphic to this specific ad-based attention model, that like, you know, why are feeds the way we think about it, or what things show up in this mechanism versus like the way that we've done it for years, which is like, you know, gatekeeping and curating. But like, if everybody can be a gatekeeper, everybody can be a publisher, everybody can be a curator of different media types, can we think about different ways of organizing that? And so I'm curious if that strikes anyone as like in kind of coming more from a, hey, how do we want to surface what kinds of media, what kinds of information we want to see from what groups of curators, and what does that look like? And so, you know, one of the experiences I had early on that was really like, I felt very eye-opening from a social perspective is has anybody collected art on Tezos at all? Like, I feel like Tezos has this incredible indie art community that like came out of nowhere, and like, you know, the version of art blocks on Tezos for generative art is called FX Hash, and FX Hash is this wide open, everybody goes crazy building generative art stuff, and it's just like this it's this totally crazy community. But like, a lot of these things came out of this initial Hicket Nunk community, that this marketplace that was built, and then the guy tore it down almost as a performance art, and then a million things popped up in place of it because everything was on chain. And as you like go through Tezos and Hicket Nunk, kind of all of these marketplaces that have come up, like you end up feeling like it's not about a fee, right? It's about like, you kind of surf the aesthetic as kind of, I remember a little bit from Web 1 days of like, or Wikipedia rabbit holes or other things like that, where you kind of like, oh, I find some art that I like, that like sits well with me, and I see, oh, what else did that artist do? Who else is collecting their work? What else do they collect? What does that artist collect? And you kind of like surf the aesthetic in a certain way. And so if you imagine similar stuff take something like humor, right, that has like a similar aesthetic, like, oh, you have a sense of humor that might be more similar in taste to someone else. And if you were able to like surf the aesthetic of tweets, for instance, that are connected not by what is of the now and of the moment and needs to be filtered in these ways, but is curated by people that also found those things funny, or what, like, and that's how you kind of move through that. I'm just wondering if there's other models to think about coming from that we don't start with like Twitter as the premise or something like that. So I'm curious how that sits with folks, but it's something I've been kind of trying to wrap my head around and feeling confused by.
It's a very good point. A few things come to my mind, but I wait. I can start, but if anyone else wants to go first, I can. Okay.
Is that almost a self-moderation, Glenn, where people by the channels that they follow, they're actually curating their own content, essentially, as opposed to an algorithm doing it for them?
Or it can be that you have groups of people that you trust to curate the content and you care about what they curate. You can still layer in moderation on the consumption side. And like, I actually just got a note from these guys at Hive. Has anybody seen this Hive AI moderation thing? So I'm gonna try to spend some time with them just to understand what they're doing. But like I wonder what, like, where else we can think about moderation that's not about this reach and these other things that this all still feels very situated in a mindset that was generated from this ad model, and that's what worries me when we talk about these things. And why do we need to get these things to scale? Like, and you mentioned the 0 to n problem thing, and maybe I'm just not technical enough to know some of like why we want to solve things algorithmically this way versus like, oh, can we just create the ecosystem in which can do this in smaller groups and situate into new organizations that can do these things.
We lost your mic, Glenn.
Yeah. Glenn, your mic is off. Okay, no, okay. So I just throw one thing here, and that's the second most interest I have besides moderating social media is understanding how can we improve like science, research, communication. And I think that's another approach. And you have a definitely different model there because it is usually very nerdy topics that just a very small amount of people care about. And then you have the traditional journal approach, obviously. And I know it from the biomedical field where there's a lot of curation and heavy, gatekeeping through journals that are big trouble and prominent, and there's peer review. And I think peer review is not wrong, but just it's a big topic, and one needs to approach it from the right perspective. But one thing landing from the physics field I like a lot, and that is the physicists are usually just smarter people on the planet rather than the biomedical ones like me. So they came up with this wonderful idea of using archive, which is a preprint server. So you would ask some people in the community, say, like, without moderation, without peer review, you can't trust anything. It has to be period. I really don't think that's the case. And they show this with archive. So while you get your paper ultimately published in a journal, there's a strong, very high interest to get it into the preprint server first, and then people can subscribe to their personal feed. And that is, they can filter down to a specific subfield they're interested in. And every morning they might get their updates in a mailbox with the 60 papers that might have been published. You could argue that's just too much to look at, but I think then it is not, because as a field domain expert, you can very quickly pass through these 60 mails and pick the 5 you want to go further in, and then the 2 that you actually are reading very deeply. And if we can capture this process, you could come up with a kind of social recommendation approach. You could say, I want to know what Glenn had in his mailbox this morning, and this is an open feed of preprints that you subscribe to, and I just want to know the ones that he read, because that might be because you are doing something that I know I'm also interested in. And I think this could be a very beautiful approach to create custom feeds. And I could do this with many other people, of course, and many other, and so my feed would proportionally grow up. But I also know the context, obviously, and could have a choice. Charles.
I have this idea. Hey, everyone. Hope you can hear me. It's a windy at the lake here. Andy, I had an idea reading your essay, which I don't want to spill too much because I guess it's really officially out tomorrow, but wonderful piece. And it's just about annotation. And in terms of the whole theme of signs and signing, I was wondering, I haven't sort of used hypothesis and the like that much, but I'm aware of it for a bunch of years. And I'm wondering about basically taking that type of a concept with the signing on the chain, and somehow it seemed to kind of relate to what's being said here. I don't know if you want to pick up on that. Thanks.
I hope that the lake is beautiful despite the wind. It's wonderful to see.
It's ironic. I have a dark background and I can't change it at the moment, but it's gorgeous here. Sorry, I'll put some things in the channel.
The beautiful coin. Kernel, the cornerstone. All right. So thank you for that, Charles. It's a wonderful question because it does link, I think, directly to what Glenn is saying. And Glenn, what you were talking about really reminds me of Vannevar Bush, right? And As We May Think, in that 45 essay, right? Like there's this whole new profession of trail makers, right, in the memex world, where like I can go and like curate this personalized trail through all of the world's information and then share that with other people. So I can like load my trail into your memex and back and forth. So you don't just get like this somewhat reductive like hypertext link, you get an entire oeuvre of work, which is really, really interesting. And it, I think, relates to what Charles is saying on annotation, but the difficult thing about it is like, okay, like how do you speak clearly about aesthetic taste, right? Because like from Kernel, there's like 2 interesting things here, right? Like the one is that like in order to build like trustless protocols, which we can use without like relying on the medium itself, that enables us to trust each other more, right? We have to be able to define and encode what it means to cheat. And that means that like it's very difficult in the realm of aesthetic expression to like do that. As I said like the other day, this is why like Bitcoin with like proof of work and longest chain, it's enormously ugly. But it's also just like profoundly beautiful because of that simplicity that allows us to think very, very clearly about what it means to cheat in the context of Bitcoin. And that's why you can have like a trustless substrate for money, even though that word is abused. And like, how do we find a similar thing for like aesthetics, what you're kind of talking about, like broader ranging human interests, as opposed to just those things which can be represented in quantifiable format? And like the critical thing about like what I am talking about and what is quite subtle to try and get across is that the paradigm that I think we all operate in is also talked about in Kernel at the very end. So we've done trust in module 0 at the very end. We do no paradigm, right? Like the inertia of language and Marianne Brunn. And there we're talking about the reward-oriented hierarchy, which I think is like an even more essential concept in like the advertising model that we all like. Advertising model is a specific manifestation of this notion of the reward-oriented hierarchy, that you have to earn what you need in order to survive, right? Whereas like society should exist to fulfill our needs such that we can go on to explore like the bounds of what humanness is, right? What it is to be human. So, you know, like in this particular model, what I like, you pay to rank, right? And you pay to vote in the system that I and this I could never ever like get it across to the people at Status why that was a good idea. And it was only when I got to the inertia of language I was like, this is why it's a good idea, because like the token itself, it's made up, right? It's magic internet money, you know, like don't fall into the same trance that we are in about fiat money. Like we make this stuff up, you know? So like this is why I'm saying like the core question this kind of thing asks is like, how does the token get brought into existence? Because if you have clarity about that, then you can like think about cost in radically different ways, and you can have this thing where like because you see what becomes toxic in all of these systems is like, cool, I can become a curator, and everybody, and now with the creator economy, and we're all going to curate things, and we're going to get rewarded. Right? Again, like rewarded, and it sounds really good given how we're conditioned, right? You ought to be rewarded. You own your data. You ought, and I'm not. You ought to live in a way which doesn't require you to be rewarded in order to be like content. Right? Like that is primary, and then we can talk about like the others. And so like these kind of systems, you know, like I understand that it's idealistic given the world that we live in, and like there has to be some kind of like meeting and compromise consideration of how things are. But like I think that the problem is like thinking about like I ought to be rewarded this work, because that comes from a place where like I don't already like have enough as a result of like the culture and environment within which I live. And like it's getting that right, which then like allows us to think about like alternate models. And this is what I was saying with Kia yesterday, right? Was that like the actual problem of scale we have is not in our technology, it's in our narratives. Our narratives are so individualized, so atomized, so isolated that like you need that first. Like you're part of a whole. I love interdependence, you know, however you want to phrase it. But the like when that narrative is prevalent, when that narrative is like paradigmatic, then perhaps we can like have these kinds of systems where like sure, there's a cost to like putting forward your curated trail into like wider user space, just as there is a cost to like, yes, this is a wonderful trail, or no, this is a terrible trail, and having that like client side moderation done on an individual basis where everybody is a curator. But that cost is not existential. You know, it's not going to get in the way of you having a place to live and your kids having a good education and you having food on the table. Right? Like that's the difference. And I know that we don't really live in that world yet. So we're just iterating there slowly, hopefully. Soon though.
But one thing I'm thinking about doing, just FYI for during KB7, is I'm thinking about creating like a decentralized media publication that we could think about how to start doing some of this curation amongst kernel and what that might look like. And I'm obviously building a bunch of these tools with Meme. And so I've been thinking a lot about the Whole Earth catalog, and like how that's what is the, you know, Kia's discussion yesterday too was really interesting. It's like, what would this look like in a decentralized world that is curated starting with a community like Kernel? And so if anybody's interested, just shoot me a note, and I'm starting to think about it and chat about it. And I know Adam's into it and Rory's into it, and a bunch of folks. So we'll start putting this thing together, and there's some other people I'm inviting into KB7 that could be really interesting on this front from the media world. And so Well, I'll keep you all posted, but shoot me a note if we can at least experiment with what that might look like. I think it would be fun.
Super quick. I'm in, by the way, Glenn, and anyone else. And I look at it as compost. It's sort of a community garden. There's a lot of stuff I'm thinking about and bringing around that, but in particular around what's been called beat reporting. And there's a couple of patterns and good working examples coming that I'll start to share. Yeah. It's happening.
Wonderful, yeah. Please continue to share everything you find from the collective hive, Charles, which you buzz around so beautifully. There's one other thing here, Jason, a beautiful question, like why would people care? Why should we care? We had this beautiful sort of space the other day with Amber Case, who's one of the researchers at the Harvard Berkman Klein Institute for Internet Research, blah, 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 and also an MIT Media Fellow. Other favorite MIT Media Fellows of people in Kernel include Brett Victor, who is just a delight. And Amber is really wonderful in so many ways, and she's like kind of most famous these days for calm technology. Calm technology. Breath, ultimate calm technology. And she was talking about, the title of the space was care is greater than optionality. This thing that like so much in the modern world, particularly in the West, pushes us toward optionality, as many options as possible. And this was another really fascinating thing that Aaron said in that talk, Martin, right? He was like, sometimes giving people a choice is itself harmful. And that's like anathema in the West. But the classic example of this is like offering a single mother who's struggling and whose child is sick to pay for the sick child if she does sexual favors for you. Just by offering her that choice, you've harmed her. A wonderful philosophical example of like how choice can be harmful, which I'd never really considered prior to having Aaron discuss it, which I thought was like very interesting. Because like we just immediately assume choice is a wonderful thing, options are a wonderful thing, but like not necessarily the case always. And I know that it's a stark example, but hopefully it drives the point home. And like what came out of that space is, Amber is doing all of this work with like a whole bunch of really big corporates, including like Amazon and a whole bunch of other places, to illustrate to them that like ultimately care is your only option, right? Like caring about what customers say at the like most basic level, but caring about the impact that you have on the environment. The example she gave was IKEA has become a steward of forests because like they use so much wood that they actually have to, because otherwise their business model is no longer sustainable. And so like as you get to increasing levels of scale, you actually have to start caring, because if you don't, it destroys completely the ability that you have to do business. And then you can begin to illustrate at higher levels that, in fact, if you like care for and give back to the environment and the people that make possible your business, you can actually earn higher returns. And that's the kind of thing that like flies well with like executives and the board, as shareholders, these kinds of people who require a particular kind of language and framing to even entertain dialogue, which is again like a separate issue, but very interesting. And she is probably one of the most persuasive people I've heard talking about this particular thing, that like you should care because like A, it's profitable, and B, your survival depends on it. And that's that space. You can find the recording. I'll send you the link if you like. It's a beautiful one.
I mean, that would be great if that feedback loop was more immediate, right? As opposed to like corporate profits, your supply chain's running out. If you had that immediate feedback, like, right, I think you see this in government, right? Where like, oh yeah, it takes 4 years to vote in a new president or, whatever, right? But people don't see that feedback loop. People see when there's no food on the table, or like if they're, but they don't see the feedback loop of like, oh, well, why did that kid punch my kid? Because, maybe single mothers and I don't know, right? Just blight. But, I agree with you, Andy. I just think that and I think you make a great point. Like if you could tie that economic factor of like caring to people And like, maybe, people talk about life, liberty, and happiness in the US, or life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, people are really pursuing happiness more than life or liberty, and they just don't care anymore. But if you could somehow integrate, either through technology or religion, or, maybe it's a combination of both, techno-religion, where they can incorporate that care into society, it's, would be a great convergence.
Who's thought a lot about technology and religion, and who has been on Kernel Fireside is Douglas Rushkoff. He wrote an old book back in 2008. It's called Nothing Sacred. It's about like how he would open source Judaism. He got in a lot of trouble for it. It's worth it, I promise. Wonderful and very funny book in Douglas's kind of very direct way. It's very, very funny.
Quick side note on Rushkoff is so he's working with this woman Rachel Rosenfeld to create this thing called the End of Institutions that I think the University of California university system is funding, and so I'm trying to get Rachel to spend some time on this decentralized magazine thing, and so I'm going to see if I can fully crypto pill her into KB7. That would be part of the show here, is trying to get this all together.
Send it just like the final 10 seconds of that Rushkoff Fireside where he was like, I don't know what you guys are doing here, but it's kind of cool.
Which block was that?
That was funny. That was very funny. But yeah, then we can chat. And Charles is right. That's we need to overhaul kernel news anyway, and that's maybe like a really interesting place to begin some deep explorations with me. Let's set some time up for that. Okay, we've got to the top of the hour. Are there any jokes, dances, other things that we might like to do before bidding each other farewell? And yeah, let me know.
I just want to just appreciate that Michael's here, and I'm a big fan of open money, so I'm curious how this all sits with you.
I'm delighted to be here. It's very rich, and what I find particularly valuable is that you're taking care, which is there's a book that Perspectiva has just published from McGilchrist's work on the two sides of the brain, master emissary stuff, and the core of the egocentric identity is acquisition and get it. What's in it for me, and the wider value is what's in it for all of us. How does this fit as a context? And the work I found most productive in that area was Eric Frank Russell's short novella published in the 50s about basically an anarchist planet where all these Gandhi dudes had been exiled because nobody could put up with the buggers. And take me to your leader. We have no leader. And how does it work? Well, it works on mind your own business and the freedom to contribute or the freedom to defect. And unless you have the ability to step away from something, then you don't have the option to be in it. So I always found that pretty central to the issue is free speech doesn't mean we all got to shout at each other and listen. And similarly, a community of care, of product, of locality, of venture in some way is only a community if the people in it, the participants in it, are finding it serves them. Is this okay for me? Am I getting what I want? And I think moving in and out of a space should be the critical part. A space is only open if you can leave it. So for our theology on this is a bit like a salon or a party. If you're having fun, stay. If you're not, go somewhere else. There's plenty of parties. If there weren't plenty of parties, then there's the power, the coercion, those factors. But once you've opened up to the opportunities, then take them. That's more or less our view on it. Anyway, thank you. And I'd love to gather more sense of what you guys are doing and how it's all working. Love the vibe. Thank you very much.
Thank you for being here. And so would we, Michael. So come along for the ride. I play. You're very welcome, and truly it's an honor to have you with us. Your work is an inspiration for many of us. So.
Well, it's more play than work.
There we go. That's why. Beautiful. Okay. Anybody else? Any final thoughts?
Just thanks again for all your thoughtfulness and everyone being here. These are some of my favorite spaces to be in, and yeah, just hope we can just keep having them and keep moving this stuff forward.
Wonderful. Yeah. Thank
really
you, Glenn. Yeah, me too. It was a really great session again to share a lot of thoughts on this topic, and I'm very happy that there's this group here, and that we can care about these things and work together on them. That's the absolute important thing. Yeah. Wonderful. Okay. It's already 7 past the hour, I guess, Andy. We close for today, and we have another session next week. Okay. Bye.